So this is the starting point, classical theories of organisations and management. I'm going to introduce some key thinkers, key writers and authors about this particular topic. And it's these people that started off the thought process from which all organisations are structured and understood today. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, there are four four categories. Classical viewpoints, so these are the original descriptors of an action or something that happened. So there's an original viewpoint, which I'm calling a classical viewpoint. There's a neoclassical viewpoint, which is something that comes later, where people revisit that original idea in relation often to accusations or attempts by contemporary authors to suggest that the original didn't work. And so your difficulty is working out who shall I write about, who shall I read, because there is so much stuff. So one of the things I'll do also is to try and identify the key texts and authors that you should be referencing. So another type of categorization is contextual. So we'll get a viewpoint that says, this is what I think. The first time it's ever been described, I'll now call it a classical viewpoint. You'll then get some time later, some years later, someone that says, actually, when I read that, first of all, it seemed to make sense, but now, based upon what I see in the world today, it doesn't make so much sense. And I'll come up with a new version, which we'll call the contemporary version. The contextual viewpoint there says, hang on, it all differs according to the context in which whatever it is happening is happening. And then you get another viewpoint that says, actually, it's really important that we understand the components of this. So you've got, from one viewpoint, this mass of stuff. As I said in the first week, you have a mass of stuff here. And the important thing here is we try and work out how it all fits together. So here's a picture. Not everybody learns in the same way. Some people like words, some people like images. Here's an image. This, I hope, is something you can memorize. If you're a memorizing sort of person for this, this is a picture that explains everything, to my mind, that you need to know about organizational structures. All the people concerned, because once you've got one idea, you can then work out what the other ideas are. And the hard thing is not working out what the ideas are, it's who the authors were. So we're going to talk through these over the next few weeks. And we all start with Max Weber. So we're looking at four strands of organising in business. We're looking at leadership, motivation, decision making, and organisations, and some other little bits and pieces. And the key players in this first tranche of authors are Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, Henri Fayol, René Likert, Elton Mayo, and Cousez and Posner. The key one is Max Weber. So the way to get high marks is a quote. That's always useful. So we have quotes, loads of quotes. Right, it all starts with Max Weber. Prior to Max Weber, writing in 1905, translated into English in 1946, prior to Max Weber, there had been other studies on this new thing called capitalism, this new thing called businesses. So we looked in the first week and at the seminars at how the Industrial Revolution transformed the economy and transformed the way that we do business. Max Weber was the first person to write down what this new methodology looked like. He was not the first. So Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Emil Durkheim had previously talked about this, but we regard Max Weber as the starting point for an understanding of organizations and behavior, at least in the West. There are three types of organizations Max Weber suggested. So I'm saying this slowly with emphasis, because for me, once you've got cracked this, the rest of it is quite easy. What Max Weber was saying is that historically there have been only two types of organizations. There's been the traditional organization and the charismatic-led organization. So a traditional organization is a structure, we've talked about before, we've talked about structures and roles and so forth, but the person heading it might be the elder of the village, or the king or queen, who's there for a variety of reasons, but primarily because of their role, either gained or taken. Then there's another type of organisation, led by someone who's charismatic, and that might be a religious organisation, as an example. So historically, until the Industrial Revolution, Max Weber was suggesting, there have only been two types of organisations. And with the Industrial Revolution, and this new way of doing business, which we might call capitalism, had come this new type of organisation, a rational organisation, where leaders were recruited and led the organisation by virtue of the fact they were the right person for the job. Not because they were the king or queen, or because they started a new religion, but because they had been put into the role as the manager. So he developed a term for this called bureaucracy, based upon the idea that there was a very clear, rational and legal structure running this organisation. So he identified various strands which make up what he called an ideal bureaucracy. Now, Weber never suggested that there was one organisation called the bureaucracy. He was simply making the observation that from his experiences and understanding, vast but only in France, his understanding was that one could identify these new types of organisations and say if you took the best of it, you would have what's called an ideal bureaucracy. So there's top-down command. So the person at the top is directing information and instructions downwards down the echelons. There's impersonal treatment. Impersonal treatment because people aren't recruited because you're a nephew of someone, or because you're an elder in another village, or because someone likes you. You're recruited because you were the right person for the job. Work was undertaken by rules which were written down. There was discipline and guidance. There was, quote, precision, speed, unambiguity, knowledge of files, continuity, discretion, unity, strict subordination, reduction of friction and the material and personal costs. These are raised to the optimum point in the strictly bureaucratic administration. What he also says within this new environmental structure, this new economic structure, there's a difference between work and not work. And the work is what the person generally does on a full-time basis, and they can have a career doing it. So careers were things that had been started to develop. And people were promoted through their career because they were the best person for the job, based upon the viewpoints of others. Not favoritism, not nepotism, not by how much you bribe someone, but because you are the best person for the job. The issue that we have is that we have to clear out of our mind all the things that have followed onwards, because the word bureaucracy and this ideal bureaucracy, this efficient organisational machine, does have issues. And the issues are summarised by the term bureaucratic, which generally means to us red tape, civil service, forms that are too long for us to understand. So various authors suggest that there are difficulties with the bureaucracy because it either stultifies creativity, because everything's written down, it's all part of a process, there are rules and regulations and people don't move from those, so there is no creativity, there's no innovation, there's no ability for someone to think or act outside the box, as we might say. And also in certain individuals it becomes quite frustrating, because all you're doing is the same thing based upon a series of rules and regulations. We have the ideal bureaucracy. Max Weber never said it was perfect. It was just the viewpoint at the time. So we start to get now this idea that you have an original author comes up with an original idea, the ideal bureaucracy, and then people start picking at it. So we have examples of that from Argyris and Wurzmer. Issues that are wrong, the issues with a bureaucratic organisation. So bureaucracy is often used in a derogatory way. It suggests a passive nature. You know, I don't have to think about things. I'm just told what to do. I have rules and regulations. I just have to meet the deadlines. Initiative may be stifled. It can lead to stereotypical behaviour, and life is full of issues where bureaucracy has been transformed into bureaucratic. The biggest one that we can remember probably was from last year with the Passport Office, where for a variety of reasons what was going to be quite a simple activity became the end of people's careers. So Weber's the first person. So Weber, ideal bureaucracy, you can memorize a list of components of the ideal bureaucracy, you can understand them, there are people who suggest there are difficulties with it. So Weber, the next one then is Frederick Taylor. These aren't linked. So these authors are really fundamental to us, because once you've got Weber, Taylor and Fayol, who's next, once you've got those in your mind, really you've got the rest, as long as you can remember their names. So Taylor was saying and expounding the principles of scientific management. This is, again, often confused, and the weaker students won't understand the true impact of Frederick Taylor. What Frederick Taylor was saying was that everybody's working to maximize prosperity. And so therefore the way to maximize prosperity is to ensure that everybody is trained and geared and recruited to be able to maximize their potential. Well, how far back? Okay. Right. So Frederick Taylor said that everybody working, whether it's an organisation or an employee, their aim is to maximise income. The organisation is there to maximise the amount of money that it earns as an organisation, and the role of the employee is to maximise the amount of money that he or she earns. I'll explain where it's been watered down in a moment. So from that, it means that the task of the manager is to ensure and develop the employee to the best of their ability, for them to achieve as much as possible. But in Frederick Taylor's terms, that was simply money. And there's the kicker, because what Frederick Taylor has been translated into is Frederick Taylor says everybody's motivated by money. And it's not as simple as that. 4 drivers, all of which are informing us today. So the fact that we're talking about Max Weber and Frederick Taylor from a long, long time ago doesn't diminish the importance to them of the work that we're still doing, because we're still doing bureaucratic and we're still working in bureaucracies. We're still undertaking scientific management. There are 4 key drivers then from Frederick Taylor. Work can be studied and understood, the development of a true science of work. We can scientifically select and develop workers. We can bring together science of work and the scientifically selected and trained workers. And there is a constant link between the management and the worker, because they're all working to maximise income. Because that's all Taylor was interested in at that time, was income. So what that means is, when you go along for a job role, you're being scientifically selected. There are various tests and routines that you'll go through, including the interview process, that are based upon theories and proven practice that form the basis of a scientific selection of an individual. When you want to be promoted within an organisation, there'll be a clear definition of what is required, and you'll have to match those requirements. In order to progress with an organisation, there'll be a clear understanding of your abilities and the gap between your abilities and where you need to be. So there'll be a series of training events and interventions offered to you so that you can develop into the role, given Taylor's original idea that all we're doing it is for the money. So we've got Weber and we've got Taylor, and the next classical viewpoint then is on Reveille L. So he was the first person really to understand that within this bureaucracy and within this scientific workplace, we have principles by which managers work. So historically, there have been 2 types of organisations: the traditionally led organisation, or the charismatic-led organisation. And now you have this thing where you have an organisation which is made up of managers. And the managers' roles can be defined. And he came up with these 14 different types of principles of management. And they are still, generally speaking, the principles of management that underpin all training and all understanding of what management is about today. They're very similar in principle to Erwick's principles of organisation. So here's the tricky bit for you as a student, in that you have to decide what it is you're going to remember, because the context won't particularly differ. There won't really be, at this level, there won't be a context where you have to decide between Henri Fayol and Erwick. The best thing for you to do is to understand that there are two authors looking at more or less the same sort of thing and understand the similarities and the differences. Because that again gives you higher marks, because one of the things we're looking in addition to wider reading is critical analysis. So it's not simply the ability to remember that Henri Fayol, 1916, 14 Principles of Management. The important thing is to understand the impact of those. So you start to build up marks by remembering that there's Henri Fayol and it's 1916 and there are 14 principles, and if you can remember some, that's great, but that's simply remembering the slide. And you don't earn top marks remembering the slide. You earn top marks for understanding that there is another author, Erwick, and there are similarities and differences, and you have an opinion based upon those, and maybe you've read something else, which gives you another insight. We have Henri Fayol with 14 principles of management, and then 5 functions of management. And generally speaking, again with some nuances and some differences, these are still generally said to be the basic principles by which we can understand what a manager does. A manager is there to forecast and plan, to organise things, to command people to do things, to coordinate activities, and generally to make sure that everything is under control. That's the function of a manager. Okay, time for another little ad break. Right, we're now going to look at neoclassical views. So only a little short break there. So we have classical viewpoints. So the originators, in this instance, Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and Henri Fayol. So we have a viewpoint then that we're looking at the contemporary viewpoints in the next couple of weeks, but we're just taking a viewpoint now that says we have this original viewpoint, the classical viewpoint, and then some decades later a kind of revision, a revisiting of that, because so many academics have written so many papers for or against. Some years later it's time to just kind of review and retrench. And generally speaking, what happens then is people start to look at particular aspects of the original ideas. One of the things that weaker students do is, apart from not turning up, not filling in or doing all the questions, not revising, and all those sorts of things, is misunderstand. So I was mentioning before about bureaucracy and bureaucratic, and making the point that Max Weber didn't say that every organisation was an ideal bureaucracy, there just was a kind of standard model. And I made the point that F.W. Taylor didn't say that everybody's motivated by money, just that everybody aspires, in his terminology, to maximise the amount of money that they can earn, because that was the way of attaining as much development as they can. Because that's all they knew at the time. That's all they could consider. So what happens thereafter is that people review this idea of bureaucracy and bureaucratic, because bureaucracy had been hammered so much in the intervening decades by other academics because of the limitations of bureaucratic, that people start then to think, actually there wasn't that much wrong with the original ideas. What they then do is they start to think, well, we had an ideal bureaucracy, actually with decades of experience, this is what we can see. Weber came up with the ideal bureaucracy, Goldner came up with the idea that there are three types of bureaucracies. They are called mock bureaucracies, representative bureaucracies, and punishment-centred bureaucracies. Mock bureaucracies are those which have a structure based around rules which have been imposed on it by an outside body. A representative bureaucracy is one where rules are presented to it by experts in the fields, and those rules and regulations are acceptable to the members of the organisation. And then there's a thing called punishment-centred bureaucracies, and that's the most common. One of the tricky things, and I still struggle with some of these authors, is the terminology is not always useful. It's the terminology that the author has come up with, not the terminology that I would use. So punishment-centred bureaucracy sounds very negative, and to a certain extent it is, but that's just the term that we've been given. So mock rules, mock bureaucracy is where it's presented, where the organisational structure is geared around people from the outside imposing rules and regulations upon them. So an example of this would be where the government changes some legislation, and everybody has to react to that legislation. No one inside the organisation is interested particularly, they're just told to do it. So that's one type of bureaucracy. A representative bureaucracy is one where the rules are being imposed by people, but the people within the organisation accept those. So one of those would be health and safety. So health and safety regulations, for instance, are imposed on an organisation, but generally speaking no one would say they're not useful to have. So within Coventry University, we could argue that we have within the estates department a representative bureaucracy, because more or less everything they do is based upon rules and regulations that are imposed upon them by people externally. Punishment-centred bureaucracies is much of the rest of the university, really, and you work under punishment-centred bureaucracies as well. So what happens here is the rules and regulations are developed over a period of time in response to things going wrong. So these other versions are where people have presented information. Punishment-centred bureaucracies, which is most organisations, is where the rules and regulations develop over time because people within the organisation have done things wrong. So as an example, you have to submit all your work through Turnitin. Yeah, Turnitin, okay? The reason you submit all your work through Turnitin is what? Sorry? To pass. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that would be a mock bureaucracy. Yeah, so the reason we use Turnitin is a system to work out whether or not how much of your work has come from elsewhere, from sources other than yourselves. And if we find that your work has come from sources other than yourselves and you haven't referenced it, then that potentially is a thing called plagiarism. And the reason we have this huge system, as every other university around the world really does, and many other institutions, the reason we have this huge system and this huge bureaucratic process supporting that huge system, and everybody's tasked with doing things, including you and including me, is because students in the past have tried to cheat. So we have this methodology now to try and stop students cheating. That's a punishment-centred set of rules and regulations. Punishment-centred bureaucracies are, generally speaking, the most frequently used. Again, it leads to efficiencies, but it's not team bonding in any particular way. So there's nothing that says this is useful for us, except there's an outcome of a conflict that happened in the past. So each year, the university has a set of rules and regulations. Those are updated to take into account anything that's gone wrong or right in the previous year. Goldner. Goldner is a name that you can pick up on and remember during the course of this time. I think the trick is for you to work out authors that you can remember. And there are loads, so you can pick and choose. These are my favourites, if I had favourites. Goldner. What he says is there are two types of bureaucracies, two types of bureaucrats. There are two types of administrators in organisations. What Weber was saying was that there was one type. What Gardner is saying is actually there are two types. So it's not a big leap here to remember Weber, one type of person, scientifically recruited, trained up, recruited by experts recruited by people who have an expertise, promoted because of the virtue. We have another set which explains a little bit about modern day of working, because it used to be that you joined a company and you were in that company for life. You had that career in that you had your career and life in that company, and at the end of it, after 25 years of service or 30 years of service or 40 years of service, you left with a pat on the back and a gold watch. So we start then to get two sets of people, it's suggested by Gardner. He calls them cosmopolitans and locals. And that's useful to understand if you can think of a kind of town. So think of an organisation like a town. You've got people who've lived in the town or the village all their lives, and then you've got newbies coming in to that town or village, buying up the properties or whatever it might be. The analogy is quite a good one, because in Gardner's terms, what you have is locals. So the locals are the people who have been in the organisation for a long time. Generally speaking, they were recruited in an era where there was less need for specialised skills, so they might be called generalists. And what you then find is the company, because of the changing requirements of the environment in which it's working, the company changes the type of people that it's recruiting. It finds that the locals, the existing people, don't have the skills and the abilities that are needed to take the organisation on. They can't get rid of them because they're doing a good job. Those jobs need to be done and continue to need to be done. But there are different skills that are needed now. And these people are called cosmopolitans in Gardner's terminology. So an organisation, whereas Weber suggested there was one type of worker, Gardner is suggesting there are two types, cosmopolitans and locals. And you can see in Coventry University that happening within the academic environment. We have in Coventry University large numbers of members of staff who have been at Coventry University for a long, long time. There are large numbers of academic members of staff who've been in the university for a long, long time and are excellent at their work. But they don't have PhDs, because when they started and all through this process, PhDs weren't particularly useful. What you needed was the all-round expertise to be able to take on various roles and responsibilities. However, Coventry University is changing the way that it works, not fundamentally, but it's adding on this research element, because in order to be successful in the future, Coventry University has to be also clearly successful in the research environment. In order to be successful in the research environment, a PhD is a minimum. So there are two tasks going through Coventry University at the moment. One is to upskill the locals, where applicable, with PhDs, but they're also buying in rather, like cosmopolitans, people who have just recruited with PhDs. There are great things about people who've got PhDs. They bring in new insights, new research and so forth, but they don't have the teaching experience. Whereas the locals have the teaching experience, but they don't have the PhD. So there has to be this mix. And what you find sometimes where there's cause for conflict is where the people who have been here a long time, who used to be promoted by the virtue of being here a long time, are no longer getting the jobs because they don't have these higher level research-based qualifications, and that can produce tension. Okay, so the third person we want to talk about, third person we talk about is another big name, Daric Pugh from Erstone University. Daric Pugh from Erstone University had worked for a long time and producing really interesting pieces of work, and in the end kind of thought, actually when you come down to it, everything that we've come up with just suggests there are 3 types of bureaucracies. He didn't call them mock, representative or punishment centred. And there's a thing called a non-bureaucracy. So we can start linking things together now. What he's describing as a non-bureaucracy is a simple organisation. So we looked at simple organisations before. What Daric Pugh is saying is everything other than a simple organisation is bureaucratic. It has to be. People argue that Google isn't bureaucratic. Google is bureaucratic. It is a bureaucracy. It has to be. There have to be rules and regulations in Google that allow people to be recruited to do the right job. There have to be policies and processes. However organic and creative the group is, they're there in a place of work, earning money, having been recruited to do that, and that's a bureaucratic function. So what Daric Pugh was saying, forget all the animosity and criticism about Weber. In the end, there is only bureaucracies, 3 types, and just little mum and dad family, one-man businesses. Everything else is a bureaucracy. And you can have bureaucracies based around the type of work, or you can have bureaucracies based around the type of people, or you can have bureaucracies based around the type of people and work, or that's it. And you have a question.
Sorry, what's
Bureaucratic. Okay. Hello. Good afternoon. Lost my place now. Okay. Bureaucratic. Bureaucratic is simply the terminology given to a bureaucracy, but it's taken to mean a negative stance. So bureaucratic nowadays we think of as being slow, inefficient, red tape, too much paperwork, too many forms, not ringing the phone, ringing the government and people not answering, spending 6 hours in the corridor in a hospital. It's those kind of connotations. So we think of bureaucratic in a negative sense, but a bureaucracy is simply the structure under which we work nowadays. Okay? Yeah? Good. Okay, so we're talking about Daric Pugh. Everything's a bureaucracy. Everything's in a bureaucracy unless it's a little company. Because the reason they're making these points, as we'll see in 2 weeks' time, is there's a batch of authors who think, no, Google isn't a bureaucracy, it's creative, it's spicy and wonderful. It's not bureaucratic. It is bureaucratic. It is bureaucracy. And again, the weaker students will not understand the fact that we can describe everything as a bureaucracy based upon the original concept of Max Weber. Very quickly then, because we're not running out of time, but we're beginning to get the same ideas. So we start now talking about leadership. So we talk about organisations, the classical view of organisations. We now start to talk about the classical view of leadership, and it's the same people. That's the beauty of this theoretical process. We start off with the same kind of people. Because once you've got the idea of the organisational structure, you can then start to get the idea of the person that is working in that organisational structure. So we have we talked about the organisational structures, and now we're going to talk about the people that work within it, the leaders and the managers. And again, there's a group of people who take up the original viewpoint, the classical viewpoint, and then there are people that we'll look at in 2 and 3 weeks' time who take an alternative viewpoint. But we start with Max Weber. So we start with Max Weber because he was the first person to describe this new modern way of working with this new modern manager and leader. And we talk about Taylor as this new way of working where the manager works on a scientific basis. And we have Reveille L, 1916. It's not that funny. We have Reveille L, describing what the managers do. So although we spent our time talking about organisational structures, we could have the same discussion. It's the same answer to a different question. So if you think of an essay exam and you've got a question on structures and a question on leadership and management, intrinsically it's the same starting point. Intrinsically it's the same kind of authors. An organisational structure has a hierarchy and is made up of leaders, managers, supervisors and administrators. The leaders look at the strategy. Where are we going? The managers look at the goals and objectives of how we're going to get there. The supervisors look after the workers and look at how we're doing, reporting on targets and achievements. And the administrators look at the process. How are we doing? Or what are we doing rather, and reporting on that. So they're basic ideas. So within any structure you have these 4 forms of activity. The difficulty is that people attempt to try and differentiate them, and we'll look at those kind of arguments. And again, the weaker students will not understand the nuances between leadership and management and groups and teams and things like that, because they'll pick up on the fact that there is a thing called leadership and there is a thing called management. Similarly, there is a thing called groups and there is a thing called teams, and they'll stop at people attempting to differentiate them. They won't go further and realise they're all the same really. Managers and leaders are generally the same. Some have more responsibilities than others, but every leader has to be a manager. Every manager has to be a leader. Okay, so management definition. The management definition of the activity of getting other people to transform resources or do things so that the results add value to the organisation in terms of reaching its organisational goals. So the manager is the person responsible for making other people do things. Management is viewed as taking place within a structured organisational setting. So this is scientific management, this is bureaucracy and Weber. Organise the setting with prescribed roles directed towards the attainment of aims and objectives, working through people using systems and procedures. So the manager is the person that requires people to do things, and the doing things takes place within an organisation with defined roles and responsibilities, timescales and so forth. And again, the stronger students will simply come up with better terminology. So a manager is responsible for getting people to do things is what a manager does. A manager is responsible for getting people to do things. A manager utilises resources to achieve organisation goals is the same thing, but with different words. Better words, higher scoring words. Leadership then is derived from someone suggesting the importance of guidance on a journey. It's the process of influencing the activities of an organised group in its efforts towards goal setting and goal achievement. Very often, leadership and management are the same. And you can see that there's very little difference here. If we take this leadership definition here, the key difference is simply the amount of work that goes into directing effort. So the leader influences the group, the manager gets other people to transform resources. So one's influencing, one's doing. Okay, so we can put them together and try and find out the differences. But what you'll find when you read the literature is it isn't clear cut. Don't get troubled with essay questions which try and get you to differentiate between leaders and managers. We'll look at how to answer a question like that in a couple of weeks' time. But the way to answer questions generally is to suggest that authors have attempted to differentiate them and then come up with a viewpoint that might be, but essentially the same. Because everybody has to be a manager, everybody has to be a leader at some point. Okay, in an ideal world then, a manager would be expected to translate the directives of those in higher levels of management, so the leader, and monitor the performance of the task in terms of how things are going on, how close we are getting to the tasks and goals. In the real world, managers spend much of their time looking at people, changing people's behaviours, affecting people. And we can get an idea then that the leader entity is someone who is moving us forward, and it's the manager who is trying to guide everybody as to how they move forward. But they may be the same person. If we think of Richard Branson, for instance, who we might consider to be a great leader, there is no possibility that Richard Branson is simply just a leader. He is not simply the person that's saying, let's go and buy this company, tell me how you get on. He has to be managing the people that report to him. John Latham, the Vice-Chancellor of this university, is the leader. There is no way that he cannot be managing those Pro-Vice-Chancellors underneath him. There is no way that those Pro-Vice-Chancellors who are managers are not leaders to the people that they are working with and who are reporting to them. So, we talked about different types of theories in terms of structures. We have classical theories that we've looked at so far. Who were the classical theorists? Max Weber, Taylor and Reveille. Good. I'm sure someone might have said that. Similarly, there are sort of classical theories as well. So the classical theory of leadership is an attempt to define what makes a good leader. And the classical theory of leadership says there are certain types of individuals who you would consider to be a leader because of their personality type. So there are some people who are more likely to be leaders than others simply because they have leadership material. And very often as part of the scientific recruitment and development, Taylor, part of the scientific recruitment and development of individuals within a Max Weber bureaucracy, there will be attempts to define what the traits of those leaders might be. So one set of guesses is Cousez and Posner. Again, different levels of marks in an answer here. Understanding that Cousez and Posner have a set of trait theories is useful. Understanding that there are 10 and understanding some examples of those is useful. Even more useful would be to understand that there are other writers who've come up with leadership traits and try and compare the two. So, this is Cousez and Posner's, based upon analysis of large numbers of business leaders, their view of what a leader looks like, the characters that a leader has. The issue, of course, is that it's very hard to work out, based upon these kinds of thought processes, who isn't a leader. So, someone who isn't honest, or competent, or fair-minded, or intelligent, or dependable, or straightforward, is not a leader. But there aren't that many people like that. So, we have a viewpoint, a classical viewpoint, which was the first attempt to come up with trait theories of what makes a leader. This then becomes criticised, and it's the criticism that we'll look at later on. We also have this other person, Kurt Lewin, that says leadership, there's not one type of leader. There are 3 different climates in which leadership takes place. There's autocratic leaders, there's democratic leaders, and laissez-faire leaders. Autocratic leaders tell people what they're doing. They make the decisions. They decide where they're going. They decide the resources, and they tell people what they're doing. Democratic leaders are the people who engage the team in what it is they're doing, so there's a kind of cohesive, collective viewpoint of where we're trying to get to. And laissez-faire leaders are the people that allow the team to make their own decisions to decide where they're going to. So within leadership, going back to the original picture here, we have, starts off with Max Weber, Taylor and Reveille. And we've simply added in a couple of new people. We've added in Cousez and Posner, trait theory, and Kurt Llewellyn, leadership climates, to try and define. We have this new thing called bureaucracy. We have the scientific recruitment and development of work. We have definitions of management, and the leader within that environment either has traits or works in a particular way. And that's all it is for the classical viewpoint. Okay, well done.